Hello, and welcome to the Social Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Jo Sharp. This month, in partnership with Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, we're kicking off a special series on social inclusion. Over 3 episodes, we'll be exploring how social protection systems can advance the economic and social inclusion of vulnerable populations across the Indo-Pacific, addressing key themes including gender equality, demographic shifts, and disability inclusion. In this episode, we're focusing in on adolescence, and especially adolescent girls. When we talk about social protection coverage over the life course, we're probably most often focused on the milestones of early childhood, working age, and old age. But adolescence is also a critical time of life. It's when girls are navigating schooling, unpaid care responsibilities, sexual debut and marriage, reproductive choices, and even work. Gender inequalities and poverty create risks to the well-being of girls and their safe, healthy, and productive transitions into adulthood. And research is increasingly showing how social protection can help address those risks and have long-term impact, especially in the face of shocks. With me now, I have 2 guests. Kath Ford is Deputy Director of the Young Lives Research Program at Oxford University, and Nyasha Tirivai is Social Policy Manager at UNICEF Innocenti. Kath and Nyasha, welcome to the Social Protection Podcast.
Great, thanks, Joanne.
Thanks, Joanne. I'm glad to be here.
Kath, starting with you. Adolescence is a critical development window where gender inequality and poverty interact to shape lifelong outcomes. Why is reaching girls in adolescence critical to disrupting cycles of gender disadvantage?
Thanks, Joanne. Well, just to give a little bit of an introduction to the Young Lives study, Young Lives has been following the lives of 12,000 young people for over 20 years now. That's across 4 countries in Ethiopia, India, Peru, and Vietnam. And we've been looking at the impact of poverty and inequality on broad life outcomes. So from infancy, early nutrition, physical growth, throughout the school years, and more recently looking into family lives and employment opportunities. So we've seen that adolescence is indeed a critical period, and we see it as critical for 2 key reasons. One, it's when we see gender differences really coming to the forefront in young people's lives. It's when gender identities are becoming much more established. And secondly, we see it as critical because what happens in adolescence has long-term impacts, not only for young people themselves, but for their children. So we see intergenerational impacts of what's happening during adolescence. 2 key areas that I'd bring to the forefront then. One is how young people are using their time. And we see that young adolescent girls in particular are spending a lot more time on unpaid care work. That has impacts on their education, increasing the risk of them dropping out of school from the age of 14, 15 onwards. It impacts their employment opportunities. It also means that we see that often young girls have less leisure time than young boys. And all of these factors have long-term impacts. The second key area is on early marriage and parenthood. So adolescent girls, unlike adolescent boys, are at much greater risk of early parenthood. And that, again, has wide impacts on the likelihood of them completing school, on their education outcomes. We also see it can impact their sense of well-being and empowerment. And that can have an impact on the next generation. Born to mothers who are younger than 18 are much more likely to be underweight and at a high risk of stunting throughout childhood. And we see those impacts into adolescence.
And so how do things like disasters and crises compound those vulnerabilities?
So we also see that these gender differences are more heightened in poorer households and in rural areas. And we're also seeing that those gender norms are exacerbated in times of shocks and crises. And we saw that, for example, during the pandemic, where we saw the increases in unpaid care work. So it might be that adolescent girls are the ones who were then looking after their younger siblings when schools were closed during the pandemic. And We are also seeing then how the impact of other shocks, so conflict in Ethiopia, but also the impact of climate change, extreme weather events such as droughts and flooding. It is typically adolescent girls and young women who will be shouldering increased unpaid care. But we've also been seeing a really profound impact of these kind of shocks right from the early years. So we see the early exposure to climate shocks, such as floods and droughts, can impact the nutritional health of young children, affecting their physical growth, so increasing the risk of stunting, etc. And we see these impacts then having a shadow in terms of their cognitive skills and their learning and educational outcomes. And again, these impacts are extending across generations. So, for example, in India, we've seen that children whose mothers were exposed to droughts or floodings during pregnancy, they then are seeing the impacts of that on their children's long-term cognitive and social and emotional skills. So that's things like their maths, their literacy, etc. So there's a real profound impact here of increasing extreme weather events, not only on the immediate time use for adolescent girls and young mothers, but we're seeing these intergenerational effects.
Nyasha, obviously there's a lot of factors in play there with some long-term consequences, as Kath has explained. So what kinds of programs do we see adolescents, and particularly adolescent girls, generally benefiting from? What kinds of programs target that cohort? And how do social protection interventions fit into that mix?
So as Kath explained, adolescence is a crucial transitional stage across the course of life, and girls particularly face a range of risks and vulnerabilities that determine their trajectory in life. So to address this, it is necessary to develop programs that benefit adolescent girls and boys as well. So today I will speak about 3 broad categories of programs for adolescent girls. First, there are programs aimed in promoting school retention and progression, such as financial support through tuition waivers or free schooling or scholarships. And social protection particularly comes into the mix as a way of aiding families in reducing poverty, which is usually a driver of school dropouts and absenteeism. One example I can give is a program that we supported government in delivering cash transfers to promote girls' education in northern Nigeria, which is a fragile context. Another type of program that I would highlight is school feeding. School feeding is a widespread social protection instrument that is being used to attract and retain children and adolescents in school. And then in the second category, we also have programs aimed at enhancing or safeguarding adolescent sexual and reproductive health. And these programs are typically provided through school spaces, but also through families and also through health facilities. So as an example, with in-school sexuality education, we have family planning information sensitization, we have community safe spaces, and we have adolescent-friendly health facilities. And social protection is now increasingly being used to facilitate access to these services. So we're also seeing cash plus programs where cash transfers are being combined with additional complementary measures. For example, training of adolescents on sexual and reproductive health, or the provision of mentoring provided by peer leaders within the communities, or the provision of behavioral change communication programs around sexual and reproductive health, or the strengthening of health facilities to become more responsive to adolescent needs. And then finally, I would highlight also another category of programs that are aimed at transforming behaviors and attitudes around harmful practices like early marriage, early pregnancy, and gender-based violence. And typically, these programs rely heavily on social and behavioral change interventions. And these interventions may include the sensitization of parents on harmful practices like early marriage, or the engagement of men through targeted sensitization, and the training of adolescents on gender equitable attitudes. And social protection is increasingly being leveraged where we see social behavioral change interventions being layered onto cash transfers with the aim of challenging gender and social norms and trying to achieve sustainable change in gender equality.
Could you give an example of some of these programs, particularly that are integrating social protection or cash transfers as part of efforts to protect girls from early parenthood, early marriage?
There are many exciting and insightful programs I could choose from. So the first example I will provide is a fascinating program from the Philippines called Protect Teen. And this is a program that is led by the Department of Social Welfare and Development in collaboration with government agencies, civil society, and local communities. Protect Teen actually aims to protect adolescents from the consequences of early marriage and pregnancy by offering targeted support for adolescent mothers. And the program was piloted in 2022 and recently underwent an expansion. And it particularly includes services like education reintegration, health services, and financial aid to support the needs of adolescent mothers and improve their psychosocial well-being, as well as that of their partners and their families. And specifically, eligible mothers are given an initial stipend, and this is like an economic empowerment grant. And moving to South Asia, we also have an interesting example from India, which is the MKUY program in Bihar state. And this is a program that integrates 11 interventions for girls from birth to the age 21. And what's interesting about this is that this program includes a series of cash transfers, and 23 of them in total, that are provided to households from the time that girls are born until they reach the age of 21. And some of the conditions that households should meet include birth registration. They should also register the girls to get an identification number. They should make sure that the girls are immunized, they attend school, and they stay unmarried up to the age of 18. And in addition to that, additional complementary services that are provided, in addition to the cash transfers, also include menstrual hygiene grants for girls and social and behavioral change components like life skills training, parental counseling, and gender training. And then finally, in Africa, we have another exciting program in Ghana where UNICEF is providing support to the government in the implementation of the Livelihood Empowerment and Productive Inclusion Program, LEPIP. So this program promotes economic and financial inclusion for at-risk and vulnerable adolescent girls, and it contributes to national efforts to reduce child marriage and teenage pregnancies by linking the National Cash Transfer Program to critical social services. So the program particularly targets girls who are aged 16 to 21 with a package of interventions that aim to improve and increase their bodily autonomy, their decision-making power, to make sure that they have safe and secure transitions to adulthood. This program started in 2024 and it's currently gradually expanding to reach many girls. And in addition to the cash transfers, the linkages to social services, they're also learning to employment opportunities that are provided and through additional training in business skills and financial literacy.
Kath, as you were outlining earlier, you've been looking at the longitudinal effects of poverty and vulnerability on adolescents. What kinds of interventions have you been studying, and what are you finding in terms of those long-term impacts?
Young Lives is an observational study. We're not doing impact evaluations per se on different programs. But because our sample sizes are so large over such a long period of time, what it allows us to do is to evaluate a whole range of different social protection programs. I wanted to pull out two specific impacts that we've seen that we think really are quite incredible and really important. So I mentioned earlier that we see alongside poverty and inequality, we're increasingly seeing the impact of shocks and crises, right? And we've looked at two specific social protection programs. One is the PSNP, the Productive Safety Net Program in Ethiopia, which is fundamentally a cash transfer program targeting food insecure, vulnerable households in rural areas. And we've also looked at the Juntos conditional cash transfer program in Peru. That being a conditional cash transfer program means that cash transfers are linked to specific criteria relating to health and education criteria. And what we've seen is that children in households that have benefited from both of these social protection programs, so they're two different, very different design programs in very different contexts. So, for example, in Ethiopia, we see that where children in households who are not receiving support through the PSMP program, the households that have experienced droughts and floods in the early years, we see an impact on the children's growth, their nutritional health, and their cognitive skills. So they're underperforming in things like maths and literacy, but we also see an impact on their more fundamental cognitive skills, long-term memory, working memory, the ability to concentrate. And we can see very clear impacts of those early shocks on those critical cognitive skills. But for children who are benefiting from the PSMP program in Ethiopia, we're seeing them protected from some of these negative impacts. So this is really important, not only to be thinking about the long term, but to be thinking about how we are allocating climate finance through adaptation programs, for example. And it's particularly important for adolescent girls, right? One of the findings that still blows my mind is that we can see that girls who have received support in the adolescent years, we see the benefits for their children, even if they've received that support before they are pregnant, right? So that's an intergenerational benefit that can be delivered in that critical adolescent phase for girls.
Whenever we talk about kind of nutrition, you'll often hear that obviously with regards to nutrition in the very early years, 0 to 5. So just to clarify, what you're also saying here is that it still matters beyond the age of 5 for girls that they're receiving these kinds of supports through adolescence as well, because that age group can fall between the cracks almost of typical social protection programs.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we see. So we're seeing critical windows of opportunity across the life course. And that's not always reflected, like you say, in policy. It's certainly not reflected in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's one of the key findings from longitudinal research such as Young Lives, is that there are these windows of opportunity throughout young people's lives. The early years really matter. The first 1,000 days really matters. But there are opportunities to support young people right the way through. And it's incredibly important that we continue to get that message out there.
I recall in an episode we ran some years ago that was looking at the cost of household nutrition. That's WFP's Fill the Nutrition Gap analysis. It was looking at the real cost of nutritious diets for a household, factoring in the particular needs of young children and pregnant women, but also adolescent girls, I think, as they begin to menstruate. So it's another one of those critical windows. Yasha, coming to you. You've also looked at the impact of social protection on outcomes for adolescent girls. Where else do we see strong evidence of impact?
Okay, thank you for that question. And I'm going to try and provide a brief overview of the state of the evidence. And just to say upfront that amongst the different types of social protection, the most robust evidence comes from social assistance, so particularly cash transfers and cash plus programs. We have good evidence from low and middle income countries that has been consolidated in recent global evidence reviews by Cirillo and colleagues. So this was a paper published in 2021, and also another recent evidence review published by Rogers and colleagues in 2024. And that review also actually included a decent amount of evidence on cash plus models. So what we see is that evidence is strongest on school participation. And by that, I'm referring to studies, many studies showing that cash transfers and cash plus programs clearly boost school enrollment and also the attendance of adolescent girls at the same time while reducing their engagement in labor outside the household. So One example that we have from the East Asia region is a scholarship program targeting adolescents aged 12 to 15 in Cambodia that increased school attendance. And what also we have seen that cash transfer programs and cashless programs also tend to have strong, consistent impacts on food security, on the nutrition and economic participation of girls. And particularly the latter impact is important because it also translates into successful transitions to adulthood, particularly in formal employment and in earnings. Another domain where we have strong evidence is around sexual behavior and violence. And here we see that cash transfers programs have strong protective effects. We have seen that these programs have successfully reduced the experience of physical, emotional, and sexual violence amongst adolescent girls. And they also delay sexual debut amongst adolescent girls. And we've also seen strong reductions in adolescent pregnancy. We have highly effective examples, including the Bolsa Familia program in Brazil or South Africa's Child Support Grant, and also national cash transfer programs in Kenya and Malawi that have been quite effective in reducing adolescent pregnancy. So those are some of the examples of where we have the strongest evidence.
Child marriage, early pregnancy, that care burden Kathy talked about earlier are deeply rooted in social and gender norms. What do we know about how to shift those norms and attitudes?
Gender norms, social norms are so complex and shifting and evolve. They're so context specific, but we do know that there are common effective strategies. So I'll take, for example, in Ethiopia, and going back to experiences of child marriage and early pregnancy, overall, over the last 2 decades, we have seen really encouraging trends in reductions in child marriage and in early pregnancy. And Nyasha's just mentioned how social protection programs such as PSMP have been part of a broad approach to help social change in those areas. So that's about addressing those underlying causes, poverty and inequality that might drive families towards early marriage for their daughters, for example. However, against those positive trends, we've much more worryingly in recent times with the impact of conflict in northern Ethiopia from most recent conflict from 2022 and still ongoing in areas of Amhara and Tigray. We've seen changes in marriage practices. In some areas, we think that the impact of conflict is delaying marriage further later in some areas, and this is often due to the cost of marriage and families experiencing economic hardship to do with the conflict, etc. But in other areas, we think there's been an increase in early and child marriage because of the conflict. And that might be actually because of financial hardship, they're responding in a different way. It might be protecting their girls from migration. So the point is that these shocks and crises can shift community attitudes, can shift norms. And so we need to make sure that strategies and approaches can evolve likewise. So that needs to be built into how we're designing social protection programs, targeting areas that are most at risk, whether that's conflict-affected areas or areas affected by droughts and floods, etc. The other thing as well, I see social protection as part of a broad approach to shifting social attitudes and shifting gender norms, engaging with whole communities, ensuring that we're including men and boys, that we're including community and religious leaders. And the legislative framework is important. It's usually not sufficient on its own, but we've seen a really positive example through the Young Lives study in Peru on how working with a whole range of stakeholders has resulted in legislative change around child marriage. And this has been specifically using Young Lives longitudinal evidence showing the long-term impact of child marriage, not only for the young girls, but on their children. That robust evidence was used in recent legislation to prohibit child marriage and close certain loopholes in the law. And certainly one of the lessons from the Young Lives study has been the importance of building long-term relationships on the ground. We're a study that's been going for almost 25 years now, and working with our local partners has enabled us to build those relationships in communities, in local government and at the national level, working alongside international agencies, working alongside NGOs, etc.
Nyasha, earlier Kath, in talking about the two examples from Ethiopia and Peru, really highlighted that they're quite different programs in terms of design, and yet they've both had positive impacts. I'm interested to hear from you, what design features matter when it comes to advancing gender equality, addressing these risks for adolescents, and particularly having that impact on pregnancy or child marriage where we see that?
What we have seen is that design features and the accompanying implementation are really crucial for the achievement of outcomes and particularly the effectiveness of social protection programs. So we can draw practical lessons from recent evidence. I'm also going to highlight some of the examples that have come up in our own research in UNICEF through the GRASP research program, which stands for Gender Responsive and Age-Sensitive Social Protection. So overall, I would start by saying that the evidence generally shows that interventions that are intentional in addressing gender inequality in program objectives, design, and delivery are the ones that are the most impactful. We normally look at the degree to which gender is addressed in the design. At minimum, we need design features to be gender sensitive, which is typically when the program ensures equitable access to benefits for boys and girls equally. However, we try to actively encourage governments and practitioners to design gender responsive programs that deliberately address the needs of girls and boys, and ideally transformative programs that challenge, the deep-rooted gender norms that influence community attitudes. And one example I can provide from our GRASP research is from Tanzania, where we studied the impact of a cash plus program for adolescents, which is called Ujana Salama. And that program provided complementary measures that were layered on top of a national conditional cash transfer program. So this included mentoring on sexual and reproductive health, gender-based violence, and also additional grants to encourage livelihoods and linkages to adolescent-friendly healthcare facilities. And what we found in this program, that it had several positive impacts that were sustained 21 months after the intervention had ended. So this shows how lasting the changes were, and some of these impacts that were sustained were reductions in sexual violence amongst females and also sexual and reproductive health seeking by males. And a major contributor to that was because of the design features, and particularly that training was delivered to boys and girls in the same face-to-face sessions, and it particularly addressed the understanding or the knowledge on gender equitable attitudes. I would also mention another crucial factor is adequacy. So this is crucial for the design of any social protection program, and especially for the cash plus programs that we're beginning to see more and more of, because they tend to be complex, multi-sectoral programs. And in our research, we keep finding that, unfortunately, the more complex a program is, the more challenges sometimes it faces when it comes to the financial and institutional capacity to deliver that program. So in most cases, we see that the plus components frequently under-resourced, or they lack in intensity, frequency, duration, or coverage needed to achieve their intent, and particularly the impact on adolescent girls. So in addition to adequacy, we can hone in on the cash transfer itself, how the cash transfer is delivered, if there are payment delays or if they're irregular, that can actually attenuate the impacts of social protection programs on adolescent outcomes.
I think we can say implementation always matters in social protection. A lot of these impact evaluations that are done, we know that the impacts aren't sustained if the adequacy dwindles over time or the implementation is poor, as you say. Nyasha and Kath, thank you so much for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you for having me today.
Super. Thank you so much.
Before we go, we like to end each episode with some quick wins. We ask a guest to bring in some recommendations for research or events or innovations that have sparked their interest or our interest and that we think you, the listener, should know more about. Joining us for Quick Wins today is Eunice Tumwebaze, who is the Manager for Gender, Youth and Children at the Kampala Capital City Authority in Uganda. A very warm welcome to the Social Protection Podcast.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and nice being here on this podcast today.
So in our main episode of the podcast today, we've been talking about social protection for adolescent girls. And you work on Uganda's first urban social protection program for girls called Girls Empowering Girls. Can I start by asking you to tell us a little bit about the program?
Well, thank you so much. And I'm happy to be here sharing about the Girls Empowering Girls program. Like you have said, the first social protection program targeting urban girls who come from the most vulnerable communities. Here we call them parishes of Kampala. And how do we know that they are vulnerable? In 2017, there was a research that was carried out. Girls were not completing school. They were dropping out because of early pregnancy. They were dropping out of school because of neglect of their parents and guardians. And in 2019, the Girls Empowering Girls came on board. What is Girls Empowering Girls? It's a program that has 3 components. The first and the most important program is mentorship. It's where you find the girls, the young girls aged between 11 to 15, are mentored by their fellow girls, talking about real life issues. In Kampala, we have issues of borders. I don't know that you've heard that one, but we use a transport system where people are carried on motorcycles. And those motorcycles are mostly driven by boys, men. And so as they drive these girls to and from school, they convince them. They end up sleeping with them and they impregnate them. Before Girls Empowering Girls, girls would stop at a level that we call primary 5. Primary 5 is about 10, 11-year-olds. That's when they would drop out of school. In one school, Katwe Primary School in particular, at one point, I think it was 2023, 24, yes. The headmistress confessed that for the first time, they had a 73 completion rate because of Girls Empowering Girls. That's one of the targeted schools that is in one of our slum areas. Before Girls Empowering Girls, girls would stop at a level that we call primary 5. Primary 5 is about 10, 11-year-olds. That's when they would drop out of school. But for the first time in 2024, she said that her girls were able to complete primary 7 and transit to secondary. So Girls Empowering Girls works with these girls to support them to transit safely to adulthood.
How are girls selected to participate in this program? Is it girls who are seen as being at risk, or is it girls who have already dropped out?
For the in-school, we choose those schools that belong to the most vulnerable parishes. So those schools that have high dropout rates, they are the ones we are working with.
Does that mean that in the schools that you've selected, does that mean all girls in that school can participate? Oh, fantastic.
From primary 6. Primary 6 is about 11, 12. Those are the most vulnerable girls. And then for the out of school, we work with the local leaders from the most vulnerable parishes. And we look for the girls that are not in school and ask why aren't they in school? Those aged between 11 and 15 years. and they are the ones that are brought on board. So it's a 4-year program. If it is in school, they are picked from primary 6, and we move with them up to secondary education 2, senior 2. It's for someone to be about 15. We think that the person has now moved out of danger. And we have seen so many of the girls transit.
So you mentioned 3 components to the program, and you've talked a bit about mentoring. What were those other components?
The other component is referral to services. Referral to services, if there is any kind of abuse in a home, if a girl faces any challenge, they are referred for health, for legal, for any support, education. If there is any support they need, they are given those services. Then the biggest that KCCA handles, and which is really not the one that we front, is the cash transfer. Through government of Uganda, UNICEF deposits money, and KCCA safely gives these girls 40,000 per month. What is this money for? Support them in buying pads, because that's the problem they said they had. To buy them books, pens, to meet their needs, to buy panties. That was their problem. That's what the borders would use. They would say, you don't have pads for next month? Let me give you money. So this little money they get, we may see it as little money, but it is supporting them to really be a little independent and make decisions that they are able to defend.
Yeah, it's so interesting to understand that even a small amount of money for basic needs can help girls to become a bit less vulnerable, and that illustration of how poverty really does increase vulnerability. But it's also really interesting to hear you say that the mentoring is the most important of those 3 components.
The mentors in the background are doing very good work. They are talking about life skills. How do you decide on key decisions? How do you interact with the opposite sex? How do you interact with other people? Or how do you plan your future? But also role modeling, also saying we made it to the university. You can also make it in life. We made it in this situation. You can also make it. And of this, we are not only looking at only Ugandans or girls from Central Region, but we are also looking at the refugee girls, because we have the urban refugees. We are also looking at girls living with disability. So it's a very beautiful program. Those girls that we found that they had dropped out of school, majority went back to school. 80% of these girls that we found when they had already dropped out of school at age 11 were able to go back to school. And others who are ready for independent living, they acquired skills. I think General Girls Empowering Girls is a very good program. It has helped about over 3,500 girls to go back to school, but also to regain their consciousness to say, I can make it in life. Those that we found when they had really lost hope can now stand in front of you and say, I'm able to do it. A lot has happened. It is not just Girls Empowering Girls now alone, but as Uganda, we have adopted Girls Empowering Girls in several versions. Currently, it's being implemented in West Nile to support the girls to go back to school. So just a small pilot, which is producing very good results that are helping the whole of Uganda.
Thank you so much, Eunice, for joining me on the Social Protection podcast today.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us on the Social Protection podcast. And a special thanks again to our friends at Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for supporting this series, and to DFAT, FCDO and UNICEF for helping to shape this episode and connect us to guests. Join us for the next episode on the demographic shifts underway in Asia and Pacific countries and how systems can prepare to support ageing populations. This podcast is a production of socialprotection.org. You can find all of our episodes on the socialprotection.org website and on your favourite podcast platforms. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review. Back next month. See you then.